Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is off to a great start to the week. Really looking forward to tonight's show. So many of our shows deal with prehistory. One of my favorite time periods for American history is kind of like that 1830s to 1850s. Poe's getting started in his career, Moby Dick and House of Seven Gables were published. Very creative period for literature. Jeff Wilson is returning tonight to integrate both topics. Jeff and I cover opposite ends of the Ohio River Valley. Occasionally we meet in the middle. One example was the Hopewell Chillicothe conference, and Barbara's probably sent back to, I don't know, Mark's going to start talking about the meeting with Cheryl and what that led to, and what I've had to or what Barbara's endured of my discussions about that. But we'll save that for another show. But Jeff co-hosted with me one time when Dennis Stone was a guest, and we did another show on the Serpent Mound summer solstice. That might have been around 2019 or so. Jeff has a series out now that is entitled Ancient Monuments Expanded Edition. The original version, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was the Smithsonian's first publication, and it came out in 1848. And it is a classic reference book for archaeologists. The eagle-eye drawings are pretty much ubiquitous. Jeff's series gives us a lot more background on the co-authors, Squire and Davis, and more, the behind-the-scenes stories. Jeff is a publisher. He published Jason Jarrell and Sarah Farmer's The Ages of the Giants. And you can learn more about Jeff by going to serpentmoundbooks.com. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good. How are you, Mark?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm really excited about this show. You have so much information get into, probably devote most of the 2 hours to looking at your achievements. But first of all, we need to talk about your upcoming appearance at the Loveland Frogman Conference. Our buddy Steve Ward is going to be there, so that's worth price of admission there. Be in Steve's presence, but you and Delcy are going to be there too. So, what can you give us a little bit of background on the Loveland Frogman Conference? When is it going to be there? What are you going to be doing?
So, this is the second annual Frogman Conference. I wasn't there last year, so I don't know what happened. I know that they moved it to a new location. It's still in Loveland, Ohio. It's at the Oasis Conference Center in Loveland, Ohio. This Saturday, March 2nd, doors open at 9:30, and they're open till 6 p.m. And they have over 50 different vendors that are selling all kinds of stuff, and they have a whole room that they're going to have speakers all day. They're going to have like Pied Piper march with costume participants and all kinds of fun stuff for the whole family, I guess. From what I understand, the reason that the Frogman Conference was established is because of a legendary incident that took place in Loveland, Ohio, where a uniformed police officer patrolling at night ran into a person that was like a mixture between a frog and a man. And he actually got out and fired off a couple of rounds at this thing before it hopped off into a river ravine and disappeared. And so it's a paranormal thing. And so the organizers and the sponsors, structured the conference around that, particularly last year. The guy who founded it is a guy by the name of Jeff Craig. May or may not be familiar with Jeff. He has created two very interesting maps, which you can purchase. One is called the Hidden Ohio Map and Guide, and his most recent one is called Map in Black. And they're both these huge fold-out maps of all the paranormal events and locations and weird, kind of things that legendary, things that you can put on a map. And his maps, he's been selling those for quite some time. And so he's the organizer of it. I think there were, like a couple thousand people that attended it last year. So I don't know how many people came this year, but he's been a cartographer for like 30 years. I met him almost probably 15 years ago. He was a vendor at the Friends of Serpent Mound's annual summer solstice event. And at the time I met him, he had minted his own Serpent Mound coins. And he was selling those at the festival. This is before I think he created his maps. But he had reached out to me a few years ago and asked if he could use one of my aerial photographs for the cover of his Map in Black. And he used a couple of additional map photos from other locations for his full United States map of, all the paranormal stuff. He includes lots and lots of mounds on there. And so he called me up and said, hey, you got this new book out. Why don't you come and talk at the Frogman Festival? I said, well, I doesn't have anything to do with Frogman. And he said, that's okay. We got all kinds of different people coming to talk about a range of stuff. So that's why I ended up going there.
But it sounds like a nightlight show.
Could be. But I had kind of a different, experience about Frogman dating back even farther. When I was in college and I was president of the astronomy club in college, my vice president and I and several members of the astronomy club would get together weekly to watch the X-Files. And my vice president of the organization was from Loveland. That's where his hometown was from. And one of the X-Files episodes in season 3, the part of the episode was set in Loveland, Ohio. And so when it, I don't know if you've seen the X-Files, but it kind of scrolls, and gives you the location. When that came up, he went ballistic, like that's my hometown, that's where I live. And we had a discussion about, that whole thing. And I told him that I had heard about this Frogman, incident that had happened. He'd never heard of it, and he was from there. And so he went home on a spring break, and he went to the local barbershop where the old-time barber was, and he asked the barber, while he's getting his hair cut, if he'd ever heard of the Frogman, and they told him all about it. And so he didn't believe it from me, but he heard it from the locals, and it turned out that the road that this incident took place was maybe about 1,000 feet from where he lived. And he had no idea that had happened there, decades earlier. So it's kind of funny. But
okay, yeah. So you do a lot of rediscovering history, whether it's Frogman or Squire and Davis's work. So, okay. And before we segue into your book, the conference is this Saturday.
Yes.
Okay. At the what was the venue again? The Oasis.
Yeah, it's the Oasis Golf Club, which is in Loveland, Ohio.
Okay, there you go. Is there a website or just Google?
There is. I think it's frogmanfestival.org.
There you go. Good. Sounds cool. Okay, let's get into your latest publication. So, what was the importance of Squire and Davis's ancient monuments, and what was their reason for writing this classic book that all prehistorians use? I'm sure all the listeners have seen some of the maps. So let's get into a little bit of the background of this important book, and then we'll move into your book.
Well, Squire and Davis's book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was published in 1848, mid-1848. It was written by two gentlemen, Ephraim George Squire and Dr. Edwin Hamilton Davis. It was edited by a guy by the name of Joseph Henry, who was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. It was the first publication by the Smithsonian Institution under a series they called Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge, and this was volume 1. The book is a collection, the first half of the book is a collection of essentially site survey maps of large mound sites throughout mostly Ohio. There are some from adjacent states, but not too many. It's mostly from Ohio, even though it has that title of Mississippi Valley. The two of them, Squire and Davis, got started in the town of Chillicothe, Ohio, in Ross County, and Squire had moved there in 1845. He came from New York, where he was from originally. Davis got his medical degree in Ohio. He attended Kenyon College and as an undergraduate, and then he went to the Cincinnati Medical College, where he got his degree. And he was from Hillsborough originally. But after he got his medical degree, he went to Bainbridge for a short period of time, and then he moved to Chillicothe, where he set up his medical practice. And so he got his start, Davis got his start excavating mounds when he was at Kenyon College. And that was in the early 1830s. And so he had a good 15 years or so of excavating mounds before Squire ever even showed up in town. And Squire wound up in Chillicothe, Ohio, because he was a newspaper editor and writer, and he had been an editor and writer at a number of different newspapers in New York and Connecticut. And when he was at his job in Connecticut, that was for a political newspaper, which he was kind of an active member in the Whig political party. The Whigs no longer exist in the United States, but for a while they were one of the two major political parties before the Republican Party was invented. And so he was very, very much opposed to Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian Democrats, essentially. He had trained as a civil engineer, and when he got out of school, it was due directly to Jackson's policies that there were no civil engineering jobs in the United States at the time. For those that don't remember that period of history, Andrew Jackson was extremely opposed to the federal government spending any money for any infrastructure projects. So did not want the federal government to spend money on roads, not on bridges, not on canals, not on anything. And of course, that's what you need civil engineers for. And so, the fact that that Jackson sort of ended federal spending on all of that stuff meant that nobody needed civil engineers really. And so, Squire never was able to practice doing it.
Look for another job.
He ended up becoming an editor for a newspaper. He got his start with another political newspaper in the early 1840s. Was when the labor movement began in the United States. The very first labor organized, group was called the Mechanics Union in New York City. And they organized because the state of New York at the time was using prison labor to do what mechanics were doing, and so it was undercutting their wages and their opportunity for jobs. And so this mechanics union formed in New York to essentially lobby politically the state of New York's government to, end that policy of using prison labor, forced prison labor. And as part of that political process, they formed a newspaper to essentially lobby their political position. And Squire was hired to be the editor of the Mechanics Union newspaper in New York, which was in Albany, New York. And so he kind of got started in politics through that labor union side. And this is kind of an interesting sort of side thing is that before, Karl Marx and his partner Engels began writing in Europe about, labor and labor issues and, developing their ideas of communism and things like that. Squire actually wrote the history of labor in both the United States and about a dozen European countries. And he gave a couple of big educational lectures / seminars to unions that were developing in New York and in Baltimore. And this is like a couple of years before Marx and Engels began their work on labor. Squire was already, down that road. Well, in the run-up to the election, 1844 election, that's when he got his job in Connecticut for a Whig newspaper. And, of course, the Whigs lost again. And so after the election, he essentially was out of a job. And so he got two job offers, one in Baltimore through his ties through labor, and the other one was in Chillicothe, Ohio, to be the editor of the weekly paper in Chillicothe. And he took the one in Chillicothe, even though the Baltimore paper was, had a higher circulation, it was, more notable, because Squire refused to work in a slave state, and Maryland was a slave state at the time. And so he, stood on his principle, and he went to Chillicothe. When he got to Chillicothe, it was about a day or so before, he started to see all the mounds around in Chillicothe, because Chillicothe was full of mounds. And he started asking around, and Davis was the local expert. Davis had been there for a long time, and he had been investigating mounds and had a big artifact collection and so on and so forth. And so Davis really, was already hard at work on studying that stuff when Squire came along. Now, at the time that they started in 1845, late 1845, started their partnership together, Davis was 31 years old and Squire was 24. People don't really put that in their heads when they began that work as fairly young men. Squire didn't know really much about anything in terms of archaeology, but he was enthusiastic and interested. Davis, scientist, medical doctor, he was the guy that paid for everything. He had the means to pay for all the excavations. They actually did very little of the work themselves. They hired people to dig for them. None of those people have ever been credited for any of the work that they did. So we don't even know the names of all the people that they hired to do all of the work for them. But Squire, because of his civil engineering background, made most of or drew many of the drafts for the maps in the book. In the second half of the book, all of the stuff relating to the artifacts that were found, almost all of that is entirely, Davis's work. But at the time, there was not a lot known about the prehistory of the United States, nor were a whole lot of people interested in that subject. There were no professional archaeologists, at the time. Nobody was getting paid at a university to teach archaeology or anything like that. There wasn't really well-developed techniques for excavating, no scientific discipline built around that. And so they worked together to try to piece together what was considered, a huge question. Who built all this stuff? No, there was no carbon dating at the time. There was no means of understanding how old these things were. There were very few people before Squire and Davis that had even tried to take on the question. And so the idea that they would put together this enormous book to discuss all of the findings that they had, that was, a bit of a pioneering effort. And so they get credited for that often. Today, if you ask modern archaeologists about this book, they'll say, yes, it's a pioneering effort, but it's totally racist. And the reason that they come to that conclusion is because Squire and Davis kind of researched, historical accounts of when the first settlers arrived, asking the Native Americans who were living here at the time about the mounds, and in almost every circumstance, no matter what tribe, was asked, they all said, oh, the mounds were already here before we arrived, and, we didn't have anything to do with them. That's largely what all of the early interactions said, and so they, were looking for, well, who would be the suspects for building all of this stuff if it wasn't the Native Americans that were encountered at the time. That today is, considered a racist idea because we kind of have learned over time through looking at carbon dating studies and DNA studies and that sort of thing, that all of these mounds were built by prehistoric Native Americans. So we might not be able to attribute them to any specific tribe, but the tribes are all descended from the people that built all this stuff originally. So that's kind of the general thrust of their book. The maps are what has really stood the test of time largely, because many of the sites that they mapped out are no longer in existence today. They've been plowed under, or these places have been developed.
Neighborhoods, railroad tracks going through them.
Right, exactly. And so a number of archaeologists over the past 175 years, since this book has come out, have used this book repeatedly for those maps and those illustrations that were in there, almost as if this book was the primary source document. And how I got involved with reprinting this book as an expanded edition was because for many years I've been working on a very comprehensive volume about Serpent Mound. And Serpent Mound was one of the locations that got their first published appearance in Squire and Davis's book. They had a very detailed, sort of illustration map, overhead view of Serpent Mound in their book. It was the first published account of it. They wrote about 5 paragraphs of it, and I went back to their original account to try to kind of fact-check them. They made several sort of factual errors in their 5 paragraphs that they wrote about Serpent Mound. But one of the things that I realized about their published illustration was that they didn't actually make the illustration. And I know that seems like a strange thing to say, because for anybody that's familiar with this book or has seen the maps reproduced in thousands of different places, the people who are always given credit for these illustrations are Squire and Davis, because it's in Squire and Davis's book. But they didn't make any of the illustrations in their book. The Smithsonian hired 2 artistic teams to produce all the illustrations in the book. There are 2 different kinds of illustrations in the book. One is that there are the full-page map illustrations, and those are lithographs. And they hired a lithographic art team out of New York City by the name of Cerrone and Major to do the lithographs. And then all the smaller illustrations, there's over 200 of those, those were done by woodcut engraving team by the name Nathaniel Orr and James Richardson, also out of New York City. And so when you look at any of the illustrations from this book, they're either Cerrone and Major's illustrations or Orr and Richardson's illustrations. And you have to understand the printing technology in 1848 to understand why this would even be important to consider. The way in which lithographs work is a lithographer will take a sheet of stone, and they will cover that stone with a wax covering. And then they will receive an illustration that they then have to copy onto that stone surface by carefully using a utensil to scrape away the wax. And they have to do that in mirror reverse to try to replicate the original drawing. There's no Xeroxing back then, nothing like that. So you hire a group to try to reproduce that in mirror reverse. So when they're done with the scraping away the wax, they apply an acid, a weak acid, to that surface. It doesn't erode the wax, but it will etch the illustration into the stone's surface. Then they wash that off, they apply their ink, and bam, they stamp that on the paper, and it comes out the right way, the reverse way on the paper. And so oftentimes the original drawings that were produced by, any number of individuals, oftentimes details are changed between the original drawing and the final print publication. And that is certainly the case with ancient monuments. And it's not something that anybody had ever considered looking at before I decided. When I realized that Serpent Mound illustration in ancient monuments was a lithograph, I went on a hunt for the original drawing. And, I took a chance. It's kind of like trying to find a needle in a haystack. After 175 years, what are the chances that still exists somewhere? And not only did I find that Serpent Mound drawing, I found probably about 90 to 95% of all of the other original draft drawings for this book. They'd never been published before. They'd never been cited before by the archaeological community, but they exist, most of them exist in a collection at the Library of Congress. And so during the pandemic is when I went to kind of study this. Everything was shut down. You couldn't access any archives or anything like that. But I worked with the curators at the Library of Congress and the librarians there, and they figured out a way that I could get access to this material. Back in 1971, the Congressional Photo Duplication Service photographed this collection on rolls of positive film, like a film strip, if you remember those back in the day. And so I was able to get access to those through interlibrary loan. They sent them out to my local library. And then I had to find a way to be able to read these film strips because nobody keeps the technology for that around anymore. It's all gone. But my mother-in-law, 25 years ago, was a member of the Adams County Genealogical Society. And 25 years ago, they were getting out of their old film strip reading technology. And she kept the reader for that, which is this big sort of box contraption that has a couple of reels, and you feed the film in, and there's a light bulb and a lens, and it projects down onto a flat white surface so that you can read this stuff. And we took that into the library, left it there for a few weeks so I could access this stuff. And eventually, this collection of papers that I was sifting through, I didn't know that these pictures would be in there. I just took a educated guess that there might be something in them. This is a collection of Squire's original papers, and the collection consists of about 12,000 pages of documents, mostly letters that he received and from people around the world, because he later in his life worked for the government, and he worked for a whole series of businesses, and so there's all these collections of all kinds of stuff that doesn't even relate to this. But they've eventually sent me 14 total rolls of film, and on roll 12 is where I found the majority of these illustrations. So it was a lot of weeks of sifting through, scratch handwriting from, the 1840s and 50s, and eventually, finding this material. Once I began to see this stuff, the very first illustration I found was actually a drawing by Davis, not by Squire, but by Davis, of Mound City in Chillicothe. And the details on this, there are significantly different details on this drawing than what appear in ancient monuments. It's much more detailed, and there are significant differences between the drawing that's in ancient monuments versus Davis's extensive map of it. And that means real-world archaeological implications. And so after I saw that very first one, and then I started to find all the rest of them, the idea came to me that, well, what would be best to, present this material would be to take the original publication, and wherever you have one of these map illustrations, insert the original drawing, because we don't have the limitations of 1848 printing technology. We can digitize this stuff, and we can have people see the original map versus the artistic impression that was a lithograph or a woodcut engraving. And then archaeologists or other people that are interested can compare these maps for themselves. They can look at the differences and see what they are, and hopefully that would be, helpful to the study of these things. That was the original, general idea. I had no idea it would take me as long as it took me to complete this book. the original book was about 350 pages in length, which everybody says, it's a colossal book. It's, amazing, whatever. I added 1,000 pages to that. So it stretched out over 3 volumes in hardcover, 2 volumes in paperback. And many of the original illustrations that I eventually added to the book were in color. And so, we made a color hardcover edition with the highest possible quality archival paper so that, these volumes will last. And then we made, cheaper black and white paperback editions, because I understand how costly the color hardcover editions are. So I tried to make them as cheap as possible so that other people can, access them. But that was sort of the general gist of why I put this together. And it turned out that I finished it last year, which was the 175th anniversary. So it's the 175th anniversary edition. The reason that's, even notable or interesting is the last big edition that was published was the 150th anniversary edition. The Smithsonian published that version in 1998. The prior major reproduction of the book was by Harvard, and they did the 125th anniversary edition, but didn't look like anybody was going to put a 175th anniversary edition out there. So, now we have one, and it has all of this additional material, all of the original source documents from, dozens of original surveyors, not Squire and Davis, but work that Squire and Davis used for their book. They used work that had been done by dozens and dozens of other people. And none of those people really got credit for their work in ancient monuments. And so I, provide little biographies of all of these people, and you have the original source maps and illustrations by these other people, many of which are more detailed than what Squire and Davis put together. Many of the descriptions of the mounds written by these original people that had surveyed it are better descriptions than what Squire and Davis provided in Ancient Monuments. So it's a very, rich historical work from that standpoint, I think. And 95% of everything that I added to the book has never been published before, had never been cited before by the archaeological community.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in a few minutes. You're covering a little bit of, like the Cerrone and Major, who Courier and Ives. Okay. So, those 2 lithographers, Napoleon Cerrone and Henry Major, they got their start by serving as apprentice artists for Nathaniel Courier at Courier and Ives, the famous, Christmas card lithographic company. They're mentioned in, the Christmas songs, Courier and Ives. And so they eventually, after they became accomplished lithographers, they struck out on their own and created their own business in New York City. And they actually became somewhat notable because they kind of struck out on their own during the Mexican-American War. The entirety of Squire and Davis's partnership took place during the Mexican-American War. That book wasn't written, their book wasn't written in a political vacuum. The changes that were taking place in the United States at that period of time, that 1848 election was the first one where
the idea of manifest destiny was first coined and used in the political campaigns of that presidential election. And that was the impetus for the idea that, well, we're going to take Texas and we're going to take New Mexico and we're going to take Arizona and we're going to take Southern California and we're going to take parts of Colorado from Mexico. That manifest destiny idea was happening during the time that Squire and Davis were writing. When they began writing their book, there were no states in the United States west of the Mississippi River. There was still the Iowa Territory and the Wisconsin Territory at the time. The idea of the western states, Ohio was one of the western states. States that were west of the Appalachian Mountains were considered the West. And so that's kind of the background of the time in which they wrote their book. But Napoleon Cerrone and Henry Major became somewhat notable and famous because they did several lithographs of the battles that were taking place during the Mexican-American War. One of their famous lithographs, which I include in the book in the introduction that I wrote, is titled "The Storming of Chapultepec," which was a battle that took place in September of 1847, where the Americans had marched all the way down to Mexico City, and Chapultepec was this sort of fort where they trained Mexican officers, and it sat up on a top of a very high hill. And the Americans stormed that fort. It was one of the last sort of holdouts. The Americans encountered very little resistance in the Mexican army when they marched down there. And, we could have taken all of Mexico, from that war, but there was some restraint, I guess. And we only took Mexico's northern territories instead. That was all set out during the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. At the time, these would have been like, news broadcasts. People got a chance to see the battle taking place through the vision of the artwork that Cerrone and Major and others were putting out there, with news articles. That was, the way people got their news of the battles and such. Napoleon Cerrone, was a very interesting character. He later switched from being a lithographer. He kind of saw the handwriting on the wall as technology was improving. One of those technologies was the beginning of photography. And so he became a photographer. He studied photography, and he ended up getting several patents for photographic equipment he developed. He became very famous in his own right because he photographed most of the famous people that lived along the East Coast in the United States at the time. People like Mark Twain, Tesla, all the actors and actresses of the day. They all went and got their portraits done by Napoleon Cerrone. And he eventually was involved in a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's a court case that set a precedent that still exists today, a very important copyright precedent. What had happened was Napoleon Cerrone did a series of portraits of the author Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde became one of the most famous people in the world in his day, partly because of the photographs that were taken by Napoleon Cerrone. They constructed this image of Oscar Wilde as this bohemian artist, And Cerrone had staged all of that in his studio. He carefully crafted all of that stuff. Well, another lithographic company took some of his photographs, and they created lithographs from those photographs and sold several 100,000 of them. Cerrone sued them over copyright. And the lithographic company said, you can't copyright photos because it's just the output of a mechanical device. And Cerrone argued, no, that's not the case. The photographer dresses the set. He dresses the model. He frames the photo. He lights the image. He creates that artistically. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with Cerrone that, and ever since, copyright has been extended to photography. And so, the guy that did the lithographs and ancient monuments is responsible for getting copyright protection in photography in the United States. So there's all kinds of little stories about, the individuals that worked on this book, were important in their own right, not just Squire and Davis.
What? And before we get into more of the, kind of like what's inaccurate, well, but we just assume it's historically accurate. What are some things in the book that you think are pretty accurate? I was just kind of going through, maybe government of the priesthood. Yeah, okay. I think there's a lot to that. Maybe Ohio has 10,000 mounds. The dense population. There's probably a lot to that. Do you agree with some of those assessments from 170 years ago? Were there some things they were right about?
Certainly in the second half of the book, the evaluations of the artifacts that they had collected, they sort of, that was all based on Davis's work. And Davis was pretty meticulous in piecing back together the broken effigy pipes that they found at Mound City, piecing together and classifying and categorizing the different kinds of artifacts that they found. And much of what he wrote and categorized became the initial basis for how archaeologists began talking about this stuff. And so it kind of set the initial parameters, for lack of a better term, or the initial paradigm for discussing, the way in which the usage of, different kinds of artifacts were considered and thought of. And not much of that has changed, to be honest. There might be, minor details here and there that have changed,
right.
But for the most part, the way in which they talk about those artifacts is still largely the same today.
Yeah.
What is different is the conclusions that they made at the end of the book have largely not held up over time, partly due to the fact that they did not understand the timescales involved.
Right, yeah.
And they did not consider that there could be migrations of people during those periods of time. Squire and Davis had some inkling that you could possibly use the counting of tree rings as a way to date certain places, and that was not their idea. Those ideas came earlier than them. There were the first tree ring studies associated with earthworks came from when the Ohio Company arrived at Marietta, and they began looking at the earthworks in Marietta. They did the first tree ring counting, and they established that, well, these things appear to be at least 800 to 1,000 years old, and if they were there before these trees, that we don't know how much older they could be, but they're at least that old. And the work by Samuel Hildreth in Marietta and Dr. John Locke in Cincinnati, they also did this kind of tree ring analysis, but their work was used by Squire and Davis. So they did not really understand the extreme time frames involved. We know today that many of the mounds and earthworks in Squire and Davis, in ancient monuments in the Mississippi Valley, are anywhere from 1000 BC to 1600 AD, a pretty long time frame. The mound sites have been dated throughout that entire time frame. Most of the major earthwork sites that Squire and Davis looked at are generally between 0 AD and 500 AD. Most of the Hopewellian era construction is a pretty big chunk of their book, partly because they're from Chillicothe, and that's where a big concentration of those mounds were located. So there are certain things that stand up, and then there are other things that now modern archaeologists kind of run down because they don't understand the time frame in which these guys were working. But one of the interesting conclusions that modern archaeology does not agree with, Squire and Davis believed that they're because of the things that they were seeing in terms of the artifacts that they were finding, they believed that there must have been at least some kind of influence by the more sophisticated prehistoric cultures in Mexico and Central America, meaning the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmec. Those different cultures really hadn't been sorted out and hadn't been identified at the time that Squire and Davis were. They knew that these things were existing down there, and reports were coming back and illustrations were coming back of those places, and they thought, well, that's more sophisticated than what we're seeing here, but there seems to be some similar iconography, and so they must have been influenced by the people down there because that culture is more sophisticated. They did not see any barrier that would have prevented people in Mexico to come up here, because there is none, right? That people can just walk from there, or they can get in a boat and sail around the Gulf and up the Mississippi and come here. There is no physical barrier to prevent anybody down there from moving up here. But modern archaeologists, they basically built Trump's Wall a long time ago, and they have declared that, there was no one from Mexico that ever came up into the continental United States. It's like ludicrous. So that assessment by them, although the physical evidence for that has not really examined, their idea for that seems to be, still a valid hypothesis. Whether or not it can be proved or not, no one has really attempted that at this point.
Okay, when we were kicking around some ideas about how to structure maybe a few segments of our talk. There is the Lisa Mills DNA test from with the Hopewell Mound group and some of the other burials in the Chillicothe area. So they would, Squire and Davis and their crew would have encountered some of the Hopewell burials. What?
Yes, they excavated at the Hopewell earthwork site, which is the site that several decades later, the Ohio Historical Society sent, some people to re-excavate. Most of the excavations of the Hopewell earthwork site outside Chillicothe were excavated by, they basically hired an archaeologist by the name of Warren K. Moorhead to excavate for the Chicago World's Fair, or the World Columbian Exposition, in 1893. So in the year prior to that, he went to that site and excavated there, and excavated about 400,000 artifacts from that site. Much of that is in the collection of the Chicago Field Museum today. But a couple of decades after Moorhead's excavations in the 1890s, the Ohio Historical Society went there and re-excavated, and they excavated a bunch of mounds, and they ended up collecting a number of skeletal remains. Those remains, about 26 to 28 people, I can't remember the exact number, were subjected to some DNA analysis by a doctoral student at Ohio State University over 20 years ago. Lisa Mills was her name. She wrote her doctoral thesis on doing the DNA analysis of these 20-some people from the Hopewell culture site. And her goal was to try to determine, or one of the goals, I should say, is to try to determine if there were any particular descendant tribes that she could link these people to. So, there are a number of tribes that lived in Ohio during the historic era when white settlers first began arriving. In the south central part of Ohio, the Shawnee were somewhat dominant. The Miami were around, the Delaware. You have the Seneca, the Wyandot, a bunch of different tribes. And she was attempting to try to find which tribe would have been the descendant population. Not only was she not able to establish a descendant Native American population, she also attempted to try to determine whether or not the people that were buried at the Hopewell site were related to a later prehistoric population in Ohio known as the Fort Ancient. They began around 1100 A.D. and maybe practiced their lifestyle up into the 1600s. And so she attempted to try to link the Hopewell, which were around from about 0 A.D. to about 500 A.D., with this later Fort Ancient population. Determined that those two populations were different DNA-wise. They were not related to one another. She attempted to find, even later historical tribes linked to the DNA of the Hopewell and could not establish that. The closest tribe DNA-wise to the Hopewell was the Iowa tribe in now what would be the state of Iowa, was where their historic, lands were in the
homeland
state of Iowa today. So the closest DNA match that she was able to determine was one of the individuals had a particular DNA mutation that she found descended to one of the burials that was found in Mound 72 in Cahokia, which is in Illinois. And the burial at Cahokia was about 1,000 years after the burial at Hopewell. So, in the 1200s, AD. So there's some, and these studies were really early DNA studies for prehistoric peoples in the United States. This happened over 20 years ago. There have not really been extensive DNA studies since. Lisa Mills' study stands pretty much alone. And that has to do with the way in which the tribes have exerted their rights under the federal government's Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which was signed into law in the early 90s, which is meant to take these prehistoric burials that are in collections of institutions around the country and return them back to the tribes for reburial. The idea is, people are not property, yet all of these institutions, like the Ohio History Connection or their named predecessor, the Ohio Historical Society, when they excavated these mounds, they put them into their collections and have treated them as property. They list them on their P&L balance sheets, for their corporations, and they have a monetary value associated with them, and so on and so forth. And people thought, no, we can't have that. Corporations can't own people, dead or alive, and so the idea was to repatriate them for reburial. And so rather than do these scientific studies on these prehistoric individuals and then return them to the tribes, the tribes are saying, no, you can't even do any of these scientific studies. You can't do carbon dating. You can't do DNA. You just have to return them, and we're going to rebury them, and we're not going to collect any of that information. And so it's kind of paralyzed the archaeological community from that standpoint. They're not getting any additional scientific data of any of these prehistoric individuals any longer. And it's, set the study of archaeology into essentially a black hole in the United States. Places like Harvard and Stanford have advanced DNA studies programs, and they are doing DNA studies of prehistoric peoples all around the world. They have very, very good detailed analysis of the migrations and settlements of prehistoric peoples in South America and in Canada and all across, Europe and Asia, and they're not working on Africa now. And then in the United States, it's just a black hole. There is nothing because the tribes refuse to allow that kind of study. So it's, those questions about, defended populations under the law, it doesn't matter. The way the law reads is that whoever essentially the last tribe that inhabited that area before they gave it up under a treaty is the one that becomes the consulting tribe for repatriation. It doesn't matter how far back you go, whether or not they're actually connected to the prehistoric peoples that they're exerting their rights over. It just does not matter. The case law is pretty clear. So Squire and Davis had no idea about those kinds of things. Like I said, there was no DNA studies back then. DNA wasn't even a figment in anybody's imagination back then. And the same thing with, carbon dating analysis. All that's done, with mass spectrometers and all that kind of stuff. So the real advanced scientific studies, they had no clue over when they were writing. But still to this day, some of their ideas and their notions are just as relevant today. And clearly their maps of the mounds, preserved information that of these earthworks that no longer exist, so.
Okay. Let's see what else can we get into. So you're going to or going through a lot of these books to prep for you adding to the original edition. And one of the really interesting aspects of studying this time period is a lot of these other scientists. I've really gotten into their observations. So some of the people really what they wrote, in say Atwater's case, 200 years ago. So some of their work is still being used by, say, the frackers. With some of I.C. White's analysis of coal fields from like the 1890s.
Right.
And you have
some of the early geologists.
Newberry, Scudder.
1830s was the first Ohio Geological Survey, 1837, 1838. And 3 of the 4 principal members that were hired to do the geological map of the state of Ohio, Charles Whittlesley, Samuel Hildreth, and John Locke, were all not just members of the Ohio Geological Survey, but Hildreth and Locke were medical doctors. Whittlesley was a geologist, and they mapped a lot of the earthworks. And in the case of Whittlesley was in charge of mapping the south central portion of Ohio, from Portsmouth up to Chillicothe, and he not just mapped the geology, he mapped all the earthworks that he could find. He ended up doing about, close to 60 different sites. And the very first of the Ohio Geological Survey, they included Dr. John Locke's survey of Fort Hill, 1838. And all of that material was used by Squire and Davis in Ancient Monuments. Whittlesley loaned Squire and Davis. Whittlesley was friends with Davis, and he loaned them about roughly 30 maps that they included in the book. Locke's work on Fort Hill and Fort Ancient wound up in the book. Hildreth's work on the Plains Mound and Marietta wound up in the book. All of these individuals got very little credit for the work that they did that then Squire and Davis just put in the book. Whittlesley, if you just count up all the maps that are in the book of all the earthwork sites, I think it's like 19% of all the maps in the book are by Whittlesley. Squire and Davis contributed 28% of the maps. 40%, a little over 40% of the maps came from James McBride, another, sort of antiquarian earthwork surveyor from the west side of Ohio in the Miami River Valley. He lived in Hamilton, Ohio, and so Butler County, Hamilton County, that area over there, McBride and his collaborators were mapping all the earthworks on the other side of the state. And a huge percentage of the earthworks in the book came from McBride. In fact, McBride, at one point I found letters, which I include in the book, that go back and forth between McBride and Squire, in which McBride says that, I'm very satisfied that you're going to put my name on the title page, that he was going to be added as a co-author. And that didn't happen. But Squire must have led him on, to actually do that. And so McBride kind of got screwed out of his contribution to the book. Without McBride's contribution to the book would have been much, much thinner. I can tell you that. So there were lots of individuals. You mentioned Caleb Atwater.
Mm-hmm.
Caleb Atwater published, in 1820 in the American Antiquarian Society's publication, a kind of a book-length piece about 10 or so. They included 10 maps of earthworks, including places like Newark earthworks and Circleville and several of the earthworks around Chillicothe. And out of the 10 maps that Atwater included, Squire and Davis essentially redid 9 of the 10. And they don't even mention Caleb Atwater in their publication. Squire seems to have some kind of beef with Atwater, and so he writes around Atwater. He actually uses Atwater's, map of the Circleville earthworks, but doesn't mention Caleb Atwater at all. Atwater was a Jacksonian Democrat, actually, and that may be where the beef came from. Atwater was actually appointed by Andrew Jackson to be an Indian liaison with the Indians in Wisconsin when they were trying to negotiate treaties with the Indians in Wisconsin in like 1830. Atwater was, a Jacksonian Democrat. One of the biggest sources of mound information that wound up in ancient monuments came from Constantine Rafinesque. Rafinesque died in like 1840 or 1841, something like that. But his archaeological papers were obtained by a friend of his from Baltimore, Maryland, the guy who began the Maryland Historical Society. Brantz Mayer was his name. And Squire became friends with Brantz Mayer, learned about Rafinesque's maps of the earthworks, mostly from Kentucky, and got Brantz Mayer to loan him all of Rafinesque's papers. And he used pretty much everything that Rafinesque wrote about the mounds and the earthworks, even though Rafinesque had died, almost a decade before. All of that wound up in ancient monuments. I think about 8 to 10% of all the maps in ancient monuments are from Rafinesque, and he sometimes gives Rafinesque credit, and other times he doesn't. But there's really dozens of map surveys that are in ancient monuments that these individuals got mostly no credit for doing. There's lots of interesting stories about some of these people that I uncovered. One of the earliest maps that was used by Squire in the book, the original surveys, map surveys, were done by a guy by the name of General William Lytle. Lytle was a land surveyor. He became the Surveyor General of the Northwest Territory, and he did a survey of what's known as the East Fork Works and the Milford Works. Those are kind of in the outskirts of Cincinnati today. And Lytle's work, he sent that to the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, of when, at the time, Thomas Jefferson was a member, and Jefferson became president of the United States. And Jefferson was very interested in the mounds and the earthworks that were being reported in the West, in the Northwest Territory, when he was president. Actually, even before he was president, when he was president of the Philosophical Society, they actually put together a program to try to learn more about the mounds and the earthworks. Jefferson actually excavated a mound on his property at Monticello, one of the first, scientific accounts of excavating a mound in the United States came from Thomas Jefferson. And so Lytle sent over his surveys, and they got all interested over there. And there was so many people writing back and forth to Lytle that he figured that, well, the best way to try to learn about all the mounds and the earthworks is to do a full survey of them. And so he put together a proposal, which they sent in to Jefferson, was to have the federal government put together a team to map all of the mounds and the earthworks in the Northwest Territory. And Jefferson determined that at the time, the federal government had limited money and limited resources, and that they only had enough money to do one scientific expedition. And they had a couple of different proposals on the table, Lytle's proposal to map all the mounds and the earthworks, but they chose and selected a different scientific proposal, which they funded, and that was the Lewis and Clark expedition. Talk about a hinge point of history. You know, like you could have had Lytle's expedition of all the mounds and the earthworks. Instead, we got the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? Which, you know, obviously is more famous. So Lytle's map were, you know, hanging around in the Philosophical Society of Ohio, where they were picked up by the ambassador to France, who was a friend of Jefferson's. And this ambassador ended up writing while he was in France, writing about some of the mounds and the earthworks in the United States, and he included Lytle's original surveys. And one of these French publications, Squire got a hold of and gave it to his lithographers, and they copied the maps of Lytle, you know, directly. And you know, that's how far back some of the maps in ancient monuments go. You know, Lytle was long dead. Lytle died in like 1831, and yet his work survived and wound up in ancient monuments, you know, decades later. And you know, if it hadn't been published in these French publications, you know, nobody would even know about it. So, you know, I tracked down a lot of that work. There's, you know, Atwater's work was published in German, you know, several times. And those maps, because they were done by different engravers than the ones here in the United States, they have different details on those maps that were published in Germany, which I also include in the book. So I include, you know, publication maps. I include the German publication maps. I you know, did quite an extensive, you know, comprehensive search for stuff for all these original source documents that made it into this expanded edition.
Yeah, and one of the interesting examples of, you know, like the lithograph, how you explained the lithograph is really a reverse mirror image of the subject. You know, you give us an example of the Liberty earthworks, how when it's printed in ancient monuments, it's actually not correct. What the lithograph is more correct.
Well, oftentimes the you know, sort of north windrose icon, which, you know, geographers use to indicate the north direction on a map, that windrose is inaccurate. So it's in the wrong place. And so when people take the maps and they go out and they try to match up what Squire and Davis have to the earthworks on the ground, they might be oriented differently. One of the one of the most apparent differences in the book is actually the Dunlap Works, which is on the north side of Chillicothe. To kind of picture this earthwork in your mind, it's kind of like the way it was printed in the original book. It's kind of like a diamond-shaped parallelogram that has a pathway connected to a circle above it. And on the right side of the square-shaped diamond, there's a very long, elongated pathway with a rounded end that encloses a little mound down at the bottom. And there's some additional earthwork things around it. But the parallelogram earthwork slopes from the upper left on the page to the lower right on the page. Actually, when you look at Squire's original survey that he drew out, that the lithographers were using as their source material, the earthwork actually slopes from the lower left to the upper right on the page. It's totally different. And so that is like if you're an archaeologist and you're going to try to figure out where this earthwork is on the ground today, and you're following the map that's published in Ancient Monuments from 1848, you're going to miss huge sections of the earthwork because they're not in the place that is indicated in those maps. And you see that over and over and over again from comparing what was published in 1848 versus the original source maps that were drawn by the original surveyors. Seriously different. They could be hundreds of feet in a different direction, additional mounds located that didn't make it on the maps. You know, lots of details like that are different. There also I found survey maps that archaeologists have struggled over from the original publication. One in particular, there is what they call a tripartite earthwork. Tripartite meaning it has like three major parts to the earthwork. Usually these tripartite earthworks consist of two large circles and a square. And one of these, which was located in the city of Chillicothe along the Scioto River, became known as the East Works by archaeologists because it was located on the east side of Chillicothe. But Squire had a survey map of it, in which he gave it a completely different name. He called it the Station Prairie Works because that term, Station Prairie, has a very specific meaning. It refers to the location where the city of Chillicothe was originally founded. There was a guy by the name of Nathaniel Massey that was the person who began the city of Chillicothe. And his original location, they built a little blockhouse that was on a prairie alongside the river, and they called that Prairie Station. And then the prairie that it was on later became known as the Station Prairie. And that's where these earthworks were located. It was on the Station Prairie. And archaeologists have struggled to figure out exactly the location of these earthworks. But on this survey, this draft survey map, it gives exact locations, and it gives the names of the houses nearby and what the distance was, to those houses. And it has very accurate, survey measurements on it. And so we can take Squire's original draft survey map, which was a full page, and actually locate where those earthworks, were located. What appears in Ancient Monuments later on is that full-page map of those earthworks was shrunk down into a quarter page, and so it lost a lot of the detail. And many of the maps in Ancient Monuments wound up that way. They were trying to save money on costs. It was very expensive to make these lithographs, the Smithsonian spent approximately $100,000 in today's money creating all of these illustrations for the original book. And so partway through the process, they were running out of money. And so they told Squire, well, you got to start consolidating. So instead of full page, illustrations for each one of these earthworks, they started to consolidate them into, 2 to a page, and then 4 to a page, and then finally 6 to a page, because they just were running out of money. And, that plays a role in the level of detail on the maps. And so when you go back to the original source maps, there are full-page maps with all kinds of additional detail that you never saw before. And so I include all of that in the book.
Okay. So, and if the listeners are enjoying this recreation of history, aside from the Frogman Conference this Saturday, you have one coming up on the Wolf Plains.
I've been asked to give a talk to the Friends of the Plains Mounds organization, which is in Athens, Ohio, and that is coming up on March the 25th, which is a Monday evening. And you can go to their Facebook page for details on that, Friends of the Plains Mounds. I'm also going to be giving a lecture about the book at the Adams County Historical Society on Monday, May 13th at 7 p.m. And Adams County Historical Society is in West Union, Ohio. And then coming up in June, I'm the president of the Friends of Serpent Mound. You mentioned at the beginning of our interview here that a number of years ago I did an interview with you about the summer solstice event that the Friends of Serpent Mound has been doing for a couple of decades. This is actually the 20th anniversary of the organization of the Friends of Serpent Mound, which is a registered 501c3 nonprofit. And the Friends of Serpent Mound is going to be not just celebrating the summer solstice as they do every year at Serpent Mound, but the 20th anniversary. And so we're going to be having a whole series of historical lectures about the history of Serpent Mound. And one of the lectures I'm going to be giving will be related to the book, I'm sure. I'm actually, I think, slated to give like 3 or 4 different presentations on different aspects of Serpent Mound's history.
Cool. Okay. What seems to be so controversial about the Wolf Plains map? Now,
this gives you some insight into, modern archaeologists are finally getting around to using modern technology to try to map where the earthworks were located on the plains outside of Athens. There was a series of circular earthwork enclosures that were on this flat plain. And as modern archaeologists are using magnetometers to try to locate, where many of these are supposed to be according to the map in ancient monuments, they're not finding them where they're mapped on, in the published map. I hunted down the original survey map that was used as the source document, and that was done by Samuel Hildreth from Marietta. I found that map amongst Squire's papers at the Library of Congress, and it is significantly different than the published map. And so had archaeologists began by going back to Hildreth's original survey map rather than using Squire and Davis, they wouldn't be wasting so much of their time by mapping empty fields. They would have, maybe been able to narrow their search a little bit better. So that original survey map by Hildreth is in the book, next to the published original map, from the lithograph artists. Saronian Major. So that's the controversy, the modern controversy around that map is, the archaeologists that are doing that work have been very highly critical of Squire and Davis, saying how terrible their maps are, how bad Squire and Davis mapping skills are. These guys didn't really, know what they were doing, and, kind of criticizing their general overall scientific skill without understanding that they didn't actually make any of the maps in the book. They were done by these artistic teams who were artistically trying to copy and interpret the original survey maps in mirror reverse for printing, not really trying to be scientifically accurate. And so the archaeological community's criticism of Squire and Davis's accuracy of their maps is really unfounded, because they're not going back to the original primary source documents. They're using what was published instead of the original stuff,
Okay. Jeff, with the Serpent Mound map that's in the book, it's interesting, but you can also go to the actual park and see it. With your
you can see the modern recreation of it. You can say, Serpent Mound was excavated by Harvard's Peabody Museum between 1886 and 1889, and one of the things that they did during those excavations was that Frederick Ward Putnam from Harvard's Peabody Museum first visited Serpent Mound in 1883. They took photographs while they were there. Those are the earliest historical photographs that we have of Serpent Mound. And they show that the mound was very much lower to the ground than it is today. And you might think, well, how can that be? What happened? How can it be taller today than it was in 1883? Well, because after Harvard acquired the property, they sent Putnam back out there. He did a bunch of excavations in the mound, and then what he said was he restored the mound, and basically he scraped up all the dirt alongside the mound and piled it up on top of it. And when he did that, he obviously amplified the size of the original mound. Well beyond what it was in 1883. But he also made some design feature changes to the mound, particularly around the head and the oval area that significantly changed what earlier artists had done and measured, including Squire and Davis, because they were the first ones to publish a drawing of Serpent Mound. I went out and actually, found the source document that Saronian Major used for their artistic interpretation of Serpent Mound, and it is significantly different. The Saronian Major map shows that the bends of the serpent are somewhat slight compared to how they are today. It's been one of the criticisms leveled against Squire and Davis is that they sucked so bad they couldn't map Serpent Mound correctly. Well, if you look at the original drawing, the original survey map that Squire had done that was used as a source for the lithographers, it actually gets those bends much better. It's much more accurate than what eventually appears in the final publication. So that's, again, unfounded criticism against Squire and Davis. But there are different details on the Squire and Davis, the Squire's, draft than what actually appear in the Saronian Major version. And the Saronian Major version has all kinds of additional, decorative details, particularly like all the rocks along the cliff and so on and so forth, that don't appear on Squire's draft. And so they, embellished a bit. And you see that on many of the maps. I also went and found Squire's original field notebooks of when he went and actually surveyed many of these mounds, including Serpent Mound. And I include those original field note drawings of Serpent Mound in the book. So you can kind of get a sense of what was he seeing when he first arrived? What are the details that he saw? And those notebooks and those illustrations I found at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. That's where that collection of material is located. That's where I also found Charles Whittlesey's original maps and field notes of all the earthwork surveys that he did. I include many of those in the book. One of the Charles Whittlesey maps, for instance, he spent a couple of days mapping all of the parts of the Newark earthworks in 1838. And the person who helped him at the time was Davis, the co-author of, Squire and Davis Writing Ancient Monuments. Davis actually helped Whittlesey in mapping the Newark earthworks back in 1838 when he was fresh out of college. And so Whittlesey and Davis actually mapped each individual segment and section of the full, Newark earthworks complex. And so, there are full page map surveys of little individual parts of the Newark earthworks that had, haven't really been used by the archaeological community at all. I got, permission to include those in my book at the same time that there was an author that wrote was writing a biography of Charles Whittlesey. The guy who was writing the biography was a geologist at I want to say, what's the university up near Youngstown? I can't remember. One of the
Youngstown State?
Not Youngstown State. It was not Wright State. I can't remember what some of those colleges are up there. But he was a geologist at this other university, was fascinated with Whittlesey. So he wrote a biography. His biography came out before my book was published, and he includes some pretty poor photocopied versions of some of those maps of the Newark earthworks in his book. But I have high-quality digital reproductions in color of those maps in my book. So he got his publication out just before mine, but we were essentially working on it at the same time.
Okay.
And so if you want to read about a biography of Charles Whittlesey, you can see some of that material. He makes a couple of, because he's a geologist, he wasn't really a mound expert per se.
A little bit of a different approach.
Well, he did not include accurate information about some of the maps that he was looking at. And so I addressed that in my book, where he, kind of went sideways on a couple of things. But for the most part, his biography is pretty good.
Since we were just talking about the Serpent Mound and Newark, with your astronomy background, and as we get towards the end of the show, you kind of work in, one of the conferences we attended, and Hively and Horn were there, and they pioneered some of that archaeoastronomy.
They certainly did. Horn and Hively actually set out to disprove another person's work. For your listeners, may or may not have heard of a guy by the name of Dr. Gerald Hawkins. But back in the 70s, early 1970s, he wrote a book about Stonehenge called Stonehenge Decoded, in which he put forward the idea that Stonehenge actually has these astronomical alignments constructed within its design. He was kind of the first one to come out and make a hypothesis about that. And Horn and Hively, by 1982 or so, 10 years after Hawkins' work had come out, Hawkins' work was incredibly controversial at the time. There were archaeologists that were incredulous about the idea that there might be astronomical alignments in these prehistoric, monuments. And so they set out to disprove what Hawkins had suggested by saying, well, we can pick any old monument and we can, find these kinds of alignments just by chance. And so they picked the Newark earthworks to do their study on. And lo and behold, what they found was, no, there actually are astronomical alignments in the design and construction of the Newark earthworks. And so they have ever since been further refining and further documenting their findings about the astronomical alignments there. And they sort of kicked off a wave of people who began to apply those archaeoastronomy methods to other sites in the United States, many here in Ohio. One of those people is the archaeologist Dr. William Romaine, who's written several books about and dozens of articles about the astronomical alignments at earthwork sites all across the United States, and ones dating back to the very first earliest earthworks in the United States that are ever been constructed, down in Louisiana. And so those ideas made their way to Serpent Mound, and actually the very first people to identify an astronomical alignment at Serpent Mound and kind of write about it extensively and publish on it was a husband and wife team, Clark and Marjorie Hardiman. They were actually from Florida, and Clark Hardiman had done some astronomical alignment analysis of one of the Florida earthwork sites called the Crystal River site, which is where the Crystal River enters into the Gulf of Mexico. And the site is a series of shell pyramids, and he identified several astronomical alignments at that site. Then, for whatever reason, they turned their attention to Serpent Mound, and they identified the summer solstice sunset alignment through the head and the oval to the horizon where the sun sets on the summer solstice. And that was the first one that was identified there. Then other people found other alignments, to the other solstices and the equinoxes, including myself. The most recent alignment that has been identified at Serpent Mound is for the winter solstice sunset. I identified that back in 2015. And so, all of the astronomical key alignments of the sun and the moon are incorporated into Serpent Mound's design. And so there's been, a handful of us that have studied that for, since the late 1980s.
And since we're talking about Bill Romaine and some Horn and Hively have been looking at these astronomical alignments. That was an aspect of the culture Squire and Davis do talk about, there was a standard unit of measurement, and, that would, at different times, the standard unit of measurement would may help to get some of these archaeoastronomy alignments correct as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the Great Circle, and it was like 1,050 feet diameter?
So Horn and Heisley attempted to find a standard unit of measure, and they settled on, I think it was 1,054 feet. Romaine, when he did his study of the Newark earthworks, he wound up with 1,053 feet. And he found that standard of measure at a number of Hopewellian earthwork sites. And so the challenge with identifying exactly what the standard unit of measure is a little bit fuzzy because of the fuzzy boundary of the earthworks themselves. Where do you determine the end of the wall to be? Where do you determine the measurement from the center of the wall, from the edge of the wall, from the inside edge of the wall, the outside edge of the wall? And so the methodology and the identification of what the exact measurement is somewhat fuzzy. And that kind of can impact some of the studies that are being done. Romaine settled on, a standard that was a foot different than what Horn and Heisley did. In the grand scheme of things, when these earthworks are, tens of acres big, hundreds of feet across, the difference of a foot here and there isn't that big a deal, right? and it's unclear whether or not they were measuring to that degree of accuracy anyways. It's likely that they weren't because, and Romaine and I have talked about this, over and over and over again. In my background, I used to teach physics and astronomy. Many of the measurements in observational astronomy are not done in feet and inches or linear distances like that. They're done using degree measurements. So how many degrees out of a 360-degree circle are you moving? Are you looking at something 3 degrees wide, 5 degrees wide, 10 degrees wide? And actually, when you're measuring with distances like that, you can standardize those measurements very quickly, and you can scale them up very quickly using degree measurements. And so we've kind of settled on perhaps the idea that they weren't using that standardized foot measurement, but they were actually using degree measurements. And there's some evidence for this with illustrations from Mexico, whereby when the Spanish arrived, they were illustrating what astronomers in those Mexican cultures were using for instruments, and they were basically using a kind of stick measurement for measuring degrees in the sky. What was the distance between one star and the other star, or what's the difference between the moon and the horizon? So that's all done in degrees. And so that might be the standard is in degrees and not in feet and inches. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it's fine. And we have about 5 minutes left. I'm sure the audience doesn't want the show to end, but they also probably need to pause to let this massive amount of information to sink. You're always welcome to come back and give us more updates on things. But in the remaining few minutes, is there anything else you want to quickly tie up? give out any
if
websites
if your listeners are interested in the book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the Expanded Edition, they cannot find it by going to Amazon. I decided to not go through Amazon because I don't think that the richest guy in the world, Jeff Bezos, needs any more money. And so I made it available exclusively through print on demand at lulu.com. But you can find links to buy the book. Like I said, there's 3 color hardcover editions, volume 1, 2, 3, and 2 paperback editions, volume 1 and 2. You can find that through going to serpentmoundbooks.com. And there are excerpts available there. If people want to see what the table of contents looks like, or, excerpts from the book. I talk about, how I chose the cover illustrations and the historical meaning around those cover illustrations, that kind of stuff. If they're interested in the books, that's where they can find them. If they're interested in reading more about this kind of stuff before getting the books, if you go out to Facebook, Serpent Mound Books has a Facebook page, and I've got about a dozen or so excerpts and illustrations from the book that I talk about. There are different aspects of the book, historical stories that I haven't really covered here. Or you can go to the Friends of Serpent Mound Facebook page, and you can see some of that stuff there, or you can find out more about upcoming events for the Friends of Serpent Mound and that kind of thing. So that might help your listeners, find more information.
Oh, yeah. You have a great family event with the summer solstice celebrations, and
this should be 4 days long. So the solstice is on the 20th, which is a Thursday, and so that Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that's how long the event will be this year.
Cool. Okay.
And it's all free to the public. Our summer solstice events are always free to the public, so you can come out and not pay a nickel, to come and hear. There's all, we have different kinds of speakers and events that are happening throughout the weekend. For instance, we have a falconer coming in who is going to be bringing different birds of prey. We did it last year. It was a big hit. You can learn a little bit about falconry and see the birds up close.
Cool.
We have the Ohio Atlatl Association comes out, so you can learn about how to throw an atlatl and actually throw those if you want. We have people that come out and exhibit their prehistoric artifacts, different collectors. We have, food vendors, so you can come out and have a good meal, good time, lots of stuff. Music, there's a dozen different musicians that are going to come out and play during the weekend. And so it's a huge event, and thousands of people come out over the years, so it's fun. Cool.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time anyways, so, we'll just wrap it there.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We'll
Thanks
get
for
the
having
archive.
me on. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, you're always welcome to return. We will be in touch, and I just want to thank the listeners for being there and supporting us. We will see you, I think next week. Dennis is going to return to talk about a spring equinox celebration at America's Stonehenge. See you.